Okay, this is a mini lesson on graphing sine and cosine graphs. For this first example, we see that they want us to graph y equals 2 sine of 2x plus pi over 2. There are two ways to set this up before we graph. You see in the red it says, if you have a period change and a phase shift, always factor about the b. We haven't used the letters A, B, C, or D yet, so this is what this means. If you have a period change, which we know we will, because the value in front of the x is going to affect our period, and if you have a phase shift, which we will, because that's going to be the horizontal phase shift, then we have a choice. We can factor. So let me go ahead and get rid of this. Let's see. I'm going to get rid of this red writing, so hold on a second. Okay, so we can delete that. I want to delete that as well. Okay, so what we can do is we can factor out the 2, and we can rewrite, something different. We can rewrite this as y equals 2 sine, factor out the 2, x plus pi over 4. If that confused you how I did it, then this might not be the method for you. If you do decide to factor out, then it's pretty basic as far as, this is going to be our amplitude. This is going to be our number that affects our period. So to find our period, we take 2 pi divided by this number. So the number that, it's the value that comes right after your sine or right after your cosine. That's what you divide 2 pi by. So our period here will be pi. And then when there's nothing immediately in front of x, like in this case it's factored out, we can just take pi over 4 and know that that is the horizontal shift, pi over 4. So if you do it that way, you get that information. If you chose not to, you could just look at the original equation and you could say, okay, this is still right there the number that affects the period. So the period would be 2 pi over 2, which would be pi. So we get the same answer even if we don't factor out. The difference is that we can't just look at pi over 2 and say that's the horizontal shift, because it's not. Anytime we have a value here and here, we either have to factor out the 2 value like we did in red, or to find the horizontal shift, we take the value that we see, the pi over 2, and we divide it by the value right there, 2. And if we can see that pi over 2 divided by 2 is the same thing as pi over 2 times 1/2, so that's pi over 4. So either way, you can get the horizontal shift, whether you factor it or you don't factor it. And so to continue graphing it, why don't we just for fun use, we're going to look at this equation, the factored equation, and go ahead and set that equal to 0. So basically we're looking at this part of it. We are going to set that part equal to 0 to see where our tick marks start. And we're going to also set it equal to 2 pi to see where the tick marks end. And so to get rid of the 2, we would divide 2 on both sides. We get x plus pi over 4 equals 0. So x equals negative pi over 4. On this side, we'll divide both sides by 2, and we'll get x plus pi over 4 equals pi. And then we'll go ahead and subtract pi over 4 from both sides. And when we do that, we have to find a common denominator, which is 4. I can rewrite pi as 4 pi over 4. So 4 pi over 4 minus pi over 4 is 3 pi over 4. Okay, now we know where to start and where to end. And of course, it's worth noticing that, I'm going to get rid of this line right here. It's worth noticing that our period, when it goes from negative pi over 4 to 3 pi over 4, that is a period of pi, just like we understood from our equation. So also it's really cool to see that We know that there's going to be a vertical shift. The equation tells us so, but so does this right here. We're going to shift to the left pi over 4. So let's quickly sketch this. Move it down a little bit. Okay, so let me make my tick marks. My first one's going to be at negative pi over 4. Going to be right here. My last one's going to be 3 pi over 4. My middle one's going to be negative pi over 4 plus 3 pi over 4. That's 2 pi over 4. You know what? I'm going to put it in writing so that can help people that are still struggling with this. So I'll have negative pi over 4 plus 3 pi over 4. When I add those two together, I get 2 pi over 4. Then I'm going to go ahead and multiply by 1/2, because really to find the center of something, you add the two ends and then you divide by 2. But instead of dividing by 2, I'm going to multiply by 1/2, which is the same thing. And I get 2 pi over 8, and that reduces 2 pi over 4. So that's how I get my pi over 4. And then I do the same thing to get negative pi over 4 plus pi over 4. Well, we don't even need to write that down, because negative pi over 4 plus pi over 4 is 0. 0 divided by 2 is 0. And then over here, to add pi over 4 plus 3 pi over 4, that's going to give me 4 pi over 4. Multiply by 1/2, which gives me 4 pi over 8, which reduced gives me pi over 2. So that's this tick mark. So once we have our tick marks, then we can choose to do the define our points either by plugging in directly negative pi over 4, 0 pi over 4, 2 pi over 2, and 3 pi over 4, or we can use the shortcut that says this. Use a different color. Okay. Since we're dealing with sine, we know sine's rhythm is 0, 1, 0, -1, 0. And if all we had was just this part, we would be done, right? We would actually go to negative pi over 4 and put a 0 there. We'd go to 0, we'd put a 1, we'd go to pi over 4, we'd put a 0. But we have more. We have two times all this stuff. So we're going to go back over to our shortcut table, and we have to multiply every single number, every single value by 2. Once again, you don't have to use this way. You can plug in these values directly into our equation, but you will get the same answers. So now we're going to go ahead and put our points. Let's see, we've got some 2's, we've got some -2's, so let's extend it up a little bit. So there's 2 and there's -2. So when I plug in negative pi over 4 to the equation, my point is at 0. When I plug in 0 in the equation, I'm sorry, when I plug in, here's the deal. I'm just going to put these 0, 2, 0, -2, 0. I can't keep going back and forth between long way and short way. Okay, so I plug in, I see 0, I plug that in, I see 2, so that means that my next tick mark is going to be 2. I see 0, that means my next tick mark is going to be 0. I see -2, that means my next tick mark is going to be at -2. And I see 0, that means my last tick mark is going to be at 0. So I'm going to go ahead and connect these, and there you have it. Okay, this next one, we can look at the equation and see what we have. We have an amplitude of 3, even though, yes, I see that it's negative. That's going to affect us when we start graphing. I can see that I have this situation, and I have two choices. I can either use it as it is right now and say, okay, that 6, what comes before the x, affects my period. So my period is 2 pi divided by 6, which is what? Pi over 3. There's my period. And then over here, I'm like, oh no, it's not my horizontal shift because I have this 6 right here. So my horizontal shift is going to be pi divided by that 6. Okay, so that's one way we could do it, or we could factor out, I could rewrite this whole thing, y equals -3 cosine. We could factor out the 6, and we end up with this. And clearly, that gives us both the same answer, that my shift, my horizontal shift is pi over 6. Okay, let me get rid of this thing right here. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and do my starting tick mark and my ending tick mark. So I'm going to go ahead and take 6x minus pi equals 0. So I get 6x equals pi. X is going to equal pi over 6, which makes sense that our first tick mark would be where our horizontal shift is. And then the last tick mark I'm going to get by setting it equal to 2 pi. I'll add pi to both sides. I'll divide by, oops, I was saying divide by x and wrote it. Okay. I'm having a little issue here. So let's see, I'm going to add pi. So I get 3 pi. I'm going to divide by 6. So I get x equals 3 pi over 6, or x equals pi over 2. Okay, so when I start to graph it, and note that from pi over 6 to pi over 2, if we took pi over 2 minus pi over 6, we would get that the period is pi over 3. Sounds a little crazy, but you can do that yourself. All right, let's look at the graph. Let's move that thing. Okay, let's do the graph real quickly. If I start out at pi over 6, and I end up at pi over 2, I know I've got 3 other tick marks to take care of. So this middle tick mark I'm going to get by saying pi over 6 plus pi over 2, which I'm going to have to find common denominators to add fractions. I need common denominators. There we go. So that's going to equal 4 pi over 6. And my last step is to divide by 2, but an easier way to think about that is to multiply by 1/2, which gives me 4 pi over 12, which when I reduce gives me pi over 3. So pi over 3 is my middle tick mark. Then to find this middle tick mark between pi over 6 and pi over 3, we're going to go ahead and give them common denominators. We're going to add them, and we're going to multiply by 1/2. So even if this is still frustrating you a little bit, know that you're doing the same thing over and over again. You are adding them together by finding common denominators, and then your answer, once you add them together, you're multiplying by 1/2, and then you're simplifying. It's as easy as that. Not to mock anybody that may be struggling with this, because you know what? It's fractions involving pi. It's a little freaky looking. All right, so then let's look at what happens when we add pi over 3 with pi over 2. We have to get the common denominator of 6. This first fraction turns into 2 pi over 6. The second fraction turns into 3 pi over 6. You add them together, you get the 5 pi over 6. You multiply by the 1/2, and you get 5 pi over 12. Okay, so we have our tick marks down. And let's see, what else do we have to do? We need to graph it. And so since it's cosine, I know cosine goes 1, 0, negative 1, 0, 1. And so I'm going to make my shortcut table. 1, 0. I'm sorry, did I say 1 and row to 0? And then I said 0 and row to 1. All right, I think I've been doing too much trig today. Okay, it's cosine, so it's 1, 0, negative 1, 0, 1. Now, if we just had this part, if it said y equals cosine of that, we would be done. We'd plot those points. But this says times negative 3. So I have to take each one of these and times it by negative 3. Here are the points that I need to graph. For my first tick mark, I graph at, oops, let me put some values here. We'll need negative 3. We'll need a positive 3. There we go. So my first tick mark at pi over 6 is where I'm going to put the negative 3. My second one is where I'm going to put the 0. My third tick mark is where I'm going to put the 3, and then back down to 0 and to negative 3. And let's kind of come in with a little curve. I find that if I start out with the little curve a little bit before, it helps me to get a better curve in. Okay, and then the last problem in this mini lesson is, I'm going to make this a little bit smaller, so we can actually look at it and do some work. Okay, hold on just a second. Okay, so here we go. We can look at the graph. We can look at the graph. Okay, so what I'm seeing is, and once again, we can come up with a lot of different equations that would be true to describe this curve. But what I'm seeing is that I'm starting this curve, with the part of the curve that I'm looking at is starting at pi over 2. And I see that it goes through its up, middle, down, middle, up. It repeats one period and it ends at 3 pi over 2. So I'm going to focus on that section because you only can focus on one period at a time to come up with your equation. Other people might choose to focus on this in a different place. I always try to do it the easiest way. So I recognize from this, even though I know cosine is 1, 0, negative 1, 0, 1, cosine's also just the general rhythm of it is up, middle, down, middle, up. Now sine is middle up, middle down, middle up, middle down. So here we go. We know that it's cosine. So we're going to write all the information down that we can that will go with this graph. So we know it's cosine. It's got the cosine rhythm. We also know that it starts at pi over 2. So that's going to be my horizontal shift. So my horizontal shift is, I said 2, but it's pi over 2. So my horizontal shift is pi over 2. I also know what my period is, because if I start at pi over 2 and I end at 3 pi over 2, then my period is I take the bigger number, which is 3 pi over 2, and I subtract the smaller where we started with, and that's pi over 2. And I get 2 pi over 2, which is pi. So I know my period is pi. I want you to notice too, as we look at the high, medium, low, medium, high, we see that we have 5 tick marks. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, just like we always do when we graph. Okay, what else can I see? I see that my middle, can you see, let's see, I'm going to use red. The middle of the graph goes right through 1. Normally, when we're graphing sine and cosine, the middle of the graph is at 0. The middle of the graph is the x-axis. But in this case, we had a vertical shift of up 1. So our vertical shift we also have. So our vertical shift is 1. And there's one other thing we haven't taken advantage of looking at this, and that is the amplitude. So remember, the amplitude is how far away is the max and the min from the middle of the graph. And so we can see that from 1, we're up 1, 2, 3. The high point is 3 away from the middle of the graph, and the low point is also 3 away. So our amplitude is 3. So now we've got enough information that we're going to put it all together in an equation. So here we go. We know it's cosine. We also know that we have a vertical shift. I like to put my vertical shift in the front, so I'm going to do that. We know our amplitude is a 3, so that's what comes next. And then we know it's cosine, so we're writing cosine. Okay, here's the tricky part. Ready? We know that its period is pi. We also know that it has a horizontal shift. So we're going to have to take advantage of factored form to make it easy for ourselves. So here's what we're going to do first. We're going to say to ourselves, how did I get pi? And we have to remember, we need to put a number here after cosine that when I take 2 pi and divide it by, I'm using a blank box as if you like how you did it back in middle school when you were solving equations, or maybe elementary school. I don't know when they introduced that. So some number, and that's what my box represents, some number when it's divided into 2 pi is going to give me my period for this graph. And this graph, the period is pi. So we can see just by using common sense that, oh, if I put a 2 in there, and so I know that what I need to put in to the box is a 2. So I would put a 2 in. Now let's say it wasn't something that was quite that obvious. I can do this. If I'm solving for the box, I can always put a 1 underneath whatever my period is. I can cross multiply, so I can get pi box equals 2 pi, and divide both sides by pi, and I can get that the box, the value that I'm looking for is 2. Now, I use a box instead of the A, B's, and C's, once again, because I think sometimes it just confuses us when we get that many more variables in. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take out the red box. We are going to rewrite our 2. But then we're going to notice something. We need parentheses because we have a horizontal shift. Okay, when you have both, you want parentheses. When you're doing a backward problem and you're writing the equation, you want to use parentheses. So we know that our theta or our x, I think we started to use x more today, we'll put that there. And since my horizontal shift is pi over 2 and it's to the right, we put minus pi over 2. As we know, with transformations, with our normal 4 functions that we work with, it's always the opposite when it comes to horizontal transformations and horizontal shifting. So there we go. This equation right here that we just wrote matches this graph that we were just given. On the test, you are going to have to do a backward problem. I think they're fun. I think if you really try hard, these backward problems will really help to make the forward problems easier. So I hope that made sense, and thank you for joining me for this mini lesson. Look on the blog for the answers to the 2 worksheets that were assigned in class today. Okay, see you in class next time. Bye.